Welcome to part one of chapter 8, which covers the introduction to business cycles. So, from here on out, we're going to be talking about short to medium run economic fluctuations in contrast to some of the long run growth and development stuff that we were looking at in the beginning of the course. So, instead of asking things like, what drives economic growth, what, causes some countries to grow faster than others, why are some countries richer than others, we're going to be asking questions like, what is a recession? What's the cause of a recession? And then what can be done in terms of policy to try to get us out of a recession or maybe even prevent us from going into a recession in the first place. So in this lecture, we're going to be covering some basic business cycle facts, and then we will talk about two of however many schools of economic thought there are for us to discuss. I think there's like 5 total that we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about the classical and the Keynesian school of economics. And then the following lecture will wrap up the other schools of thought, and then we'll move on to chapter 9. So, to start out with some basic business cycle facts, output movements aren't regular. So you're not going to be seeing regular fluctuations in GDP. You're not going to be seeing predictable fluctuations in GDP across different business cycles. If we look at the recession in 1970, GDP fell by about 1.1%. In 1957, it fell by 3.7%. If we look at the times between recessions, it can go from as little as 4 quarters to over 10 years. And when we're looking at how quickly we're seeing economic declines, in 1980, GDP fell 2.2% in 1 quarter. In 1990-91, there was a 1.5% decline over 3 quarters. And then in 2020, there was a 31% decline just in 1 quarter alone. So we've got these pretty irregular movements in output. And it can't all be from something like total factor productivity driving it, right? It can't all be just these real supply side factors that are driving it. It'd be kind of cool if it was, because then, we'd have a generally pretty good idea what's driving it, at least sort of like at an aggregated level. But I guess it wouldn't really make the economic research very interesting, because there's also nominal shocks. There's like demand side shocks that would be driving some of this stuff as well. So if we look at GDP, excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold. Between 1945 and I think it was like 2018, 2019, the last time I added data to this graph. I really need to update it, considering it is now 2023, but you can still get the general idea of what's going on here. You can see that every time GDP declines a little bit, like here, you can see that it's not all falling by the same amount, and it's not falling at the same pace. You have very sharp declines, you have very slow declines. And that's just kind of the way things go when it comes to looking at macroeconomic fluctuations. So these output movements aren't regular. We've pretty much established that. When macro researchers way back in the day were trying to understand these output fluctuations, they first wanted to try to look at it as like linear combinations of like deterministic cycles of different lengths. And that was relatively short-lived. That didn't last very long. And they realized that a better way to look at it, a better way to model this, is that these economic fluctuations are coming from random shocks, which hit the economy in different places, different parts, different ways at different times. And what I mean by random here isn't like this totally arbitrary thing. No, by random, what I mean is it is a process that is subject to the laws of probability. So there's always some positive probability that a shock will hit a certain part of the economy. And it's really just kind of, we can look at it as like a matter of time before it happens. So every period, there's going to be some positive, non-zero probability that this particular event will occur. And that's the way these shocks are being modeled. Now, when it comes to the different schools of economic thought, especially when we're talking about some of the later schools of thought, a lot of the differences are really just in the hypothesis surrounding the source of shock, the source of these shocks that we're looking at. Where are they hitting? What sector of the economy, what side of the economy are they hitting? And then their propagation mechanisms. How do these real shocks actually transmit from one side of the economy to the other? So if it's like a nominal shock, how is it going to transmit from a nominal side of the economy over to the real side and thus affect real GDP? Another fact that's really interesting is that these fluctuations aren't evenly distributed across sectors. So inventory investment it makes up less than 1% of GDP, but it's responsible for nearly half of all of GDP fluctuations. And we'll get into that in a little bit when we talk about how volatile investment is. Consumer purchases, on the other hand, is relatively stable, and it implies something known as consumption smoothing, which we will also be talking about in a little bit. Now, there are asymmetries in output market movements, but there's no real asymmetry between rises and falls in output. So growth is distributed symmetrically about the mean. But what's interesting, though, is that when we're looking at this, there seems to be more time that output is above its usual path than it is below. So more often things are good and things aren't bad as often, which is, I guess, good for us, right? So the next question is really, is there a way to quantify when the economy is doing well? Fortunately for us, there is. So we can look at positive and negative trends in economic growth. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, an economy enters a recession when it experiences 2 or more consecutive periods of negative economic growth. Now, in the United States, it's 2 or more consecutive quarters of economic growth, which means that we need 6 months of negative growth to be in a recession. So when you think about it, that's got to be a pretty persistent and prolonged loss in GDP for us to be there. So it makes sure that little short-term hiccups aren't treated as recessions. Now, these recessions, as we've already covered, can vary in length and severity. Some are very short-lived. Others last, a pretty long time. If we look at the Great Depression, that lasted a really, really long time. But we also have recessions that were relatively short-lived. Now, when we're looking at the Great Depression, right, it's before World War II, and there were some biases in how some of the data was recorded and accounted for prior to World War II. Things changed a little after in terms of how they were being recorded. And when some economists looked at that, right, tried to see how different these things were, if sort of the measuring standards were the same across the board, it actually showed that these aggregate fluctuations really weren't all that terribly different. So it really suggests that either character of fluctuations is determined by forces that change less over time, or there was a set of changes that had sort of roughly offset these fluctuations. Not really sure which, but that's for other economists to go and try to answer that question. Now, the collapse after 1929 and the rebound in the 1930s dwarfs any fluctuations that we've seen before or after. Real GDP fell by 27% and unemployment peaked at 25% in 1933. Now, over the next 11 years, GDP rose at an average of about 10%. And by 1944, unemployment was 1.2%. Now, of course, that also accounts for World War II because we were sending, a lot of working age males overseas to go fight the war. And when that's the case, if you remember, the composition of the labor force, if you are employed in the military, you are not counted in the labor force. Thus, you have a lot of people in the military going overseas and fighting a war, you're going to have a very low unemployment rate. But when they came back after the war, obviously the economy needed to restructure in order to reabsorb all of these people back into the labor market. So between 1944 and 1947, we did have a recession. Real GDP fell by about 13%. Unemployment rose to 3.9%. Now, why would that have been the case? Well, if we're putting all of our production efforts into the war, So we're building a lot of bombers. We're building a lot of fighters. We're building guns. We got to build bombs. All these things, right? Normal companies that are, typically producing goods for civilian consumption would begin producing stuff for the war effort instead. For example, my stepfather actually has an old World War II rifle built by Rockola. Rockola, built the those jukeboxes. So we had a lot of companies go, all right, we're not going to produce our stuff as much. We're going to produce stuff for the war effort instead. So when the war ends, well, they've got to switch back to what they were making before, and that takes time. You're not going to be able to do it overnight. And so that generated a short recession. And of course, with all these soldiers coming back, they needed to find work. And when they, were trying to find work, unemployment rose a little bit. Now, obviously, everything sort of settled back down. The economy restructured. They were reabsorbed. That was that. Let's look at COVID, right, in 2020. GDP fell by more than 30%, but it was extremely short-lived, and that rebound was, well, really fast. Right now, if we compare that to the Great Depression, which was markedly worse, even though GDP didn't fall by as much, it remained low for a much longer period of time, not just like a couple of months. So we've seen that during recessions, output falls and then unemployment rises. What's interesting, though, is the length of the average work week also falls, and these declines in employment and hours worked are relatively small compared to output fluctuations. And somebody actually noticed this, and they looked at it and found like an empirical relationship, and it's now known as Okun's Law. And what it suggests is that for every 1% increase in unemployment, GDP is going to fall by about 2%. Now, of course, it's not always like 1%, 2%. It varies depending on, what time you're looking at, what countries you're looking at, things like that. But it's a nice little rule of thumb to try to go by. So, judging from the fact that there's Okun's Law, we can establish that there's at least a relationship between two macro variables. Maybe there's more. We don't really know yet. But these macro variables can go by another name, and that's indicators. Now, we've got different types of indicators. We've got indicators that happen or indicate something occurring before GDP fluctuates. We've got indicators that suggest, some kind of movement after GDP has begun fluctuating. Then we've got, indicators that move with GDP. Now, the first one we're going to talk about are leading indicators. That's a macro variable that tends to fluctuate in advance of the overall economy. And I've got a lot of these indicators listed here. Some of these I'll cover, some of them, such as stock prices, the stock of M2, and the yield spread between 10-year Treasury and 3-month Treasuries, aren't really something I'm going to cover right now. That's more like monetary economic stuff. When we talk about some monetary economics, we'll come back to this. But these other indicators, like, say, new orders for consumer goods, new orders for non-defense capital goods, supplier deliveries, and building permits, right? These are something that we can discuss right now because we have the tools to understand why these would be moving in advance of the economy. So let's say, you own a decent-sized company and you want to expand a little bit. Well, if you're going to be doing that, you're like, all right, well, I want to, say put up a new building for operations. And if I do that, well, it's going to take time. I got to get a building permit. I've got to hire people to come in and, draw up the plans. And then I got to get other people to come in and actually, build the damn thing. That's going to take time. And you're probably going to finance it. You're probably not going to just, do it, with your own cash right now. You might borrow some money to do it. So, interest rates might matter. And if the economy's not looking too good, if you're not particularly happy about the direction the economy's going, you may hold off. You may go, I'm not going to build this right now. Maybe we'll go into a recession. When we're coming out of the recession, maybe then I'll start trying to put this building up. And so you're going to hold off if you don't see the economy going so well. Now, if you want to move up a little bit, in terms of, expenditures, the amount that are going to be spent. Let's say there's, a really, really, really big corporation. You guys want to buy a new Gulfstream. Well, that's going to take, it's going to cost at least 60, $70 million to get the Gulfstream. And it's going to take a couple of years to get that Gulfstream in. It's not just going to be like, you place the order and you get it next month or something. It's going to be a couple of years down the road. If you're, not too, your predictions for the economy aren't too favorable over the next couple of years, you're probably going to hold off on buying that Gulfstream, which of course means that the delivery for that Gulfstream, whenever it comes in, or would have come in, obviously isn't going to happen. So the delivery of that plane never occurs. Overall, supplier deliveries begin to fall. So we can kind of see how these would be decent indicators of economic fluctuations. Now, of course, it's not guaranteed. It's not like, oh, well, supplier deliveries fell, so the economy is going to go into a recession. It's not always a guaranteed thing. But more often than not, it's something that we can go, all right, yeah, it's probably going to happen. Now, we've covered leading indicators. Those are cool. But what about lagging indicators? And this is something that changes after the economy's started fluctuating. So the leading indicator helps us go, okay, there might be a recession on the horizon. With lagging indicators, we go, okay, if the leading indicator suggested this drops, and now we're looking at this, maybe we're definitely in a recession. So these things would be like the unemployment rate, right? If GDP begins to fall, you're going to see the unemployment rate go up. Business spending is going to drop substantially. Business profits are going to drop. Why? Because, well, business spending has fallen, and then also consumer spending has fallen. Now, you're also going to see an increase in inflation when the economy goes into a recession. Why is that? Well, when the economy goes into a recession, the central bank is going to engage in expansionary monetary policy, and what ends up happening is you do see a little bit of an uptick in inflation because the central bank put more money into the economy. And then, you got more money chasing fewer goods. Boom, inflation. So these would be some decent lagging indicators. Now, there are also indicators that occur pretty much at the same time. So instead of trying to predict future events, these run at the same time as said economic events, and personal income would be one of them, right? If the wages that you're earning begin to fall, like, I don't know, say somebody in the household lost their job because we're in a recession, well, that would generally be a pretty good indicator that we are in a recession. Now, there's this great joke that my uncle told me about 10 years ago, and the older I get and the more I learn about macroeconomics, the funnier it gets. And it said if you lined up every macroeconomist in the world, you couldn't get from here to a conclusion. What do I mean by this? Well, what I mean is that there are many different schools of thought in macroeconomics. Economists don't just all go, all right, well, we agree on the same things all the time, and thus, if we agree on the same sort of like baseline, like stylized facts, then we're all going to come to the same conclusion. That's not always the case. Now, we may agree on most of the baseline stylized facts, like, what a recession is, what some indicators are going into and coming out of a recession, things like that. But in terms of things like the sources of shocks, how the shocks will propagate throughout the economic system, the way that the economic system can be modeled, things like that, there are very, very, very stark differences between these different schools of thought. Now, almost all of these schools have some pretty good ideas. None of them are perfect, and admittedly, some are way less perfect than others. And mostly, as I had said, these schools of thought differ on how we can model the economy, how we can model shocks to the economy, namely in deviations from steady state. So if you remember that from the solo growth model, we put everything into a steady state, and then we shock the steady state to see how the system responds. There's also things like the sources of shocks to the business cycle. Some economists think that supply-side shocks explain a majority of GDP fluctuations. Others think that demand-side shocks explain a majority of fluctuations in GDP. And then there's, as a result of really the first two, especially the second bullet point there's a lot of difference in the role that government can play in mitigating the business cycles. Some people think that if demand side shocks explain a majority of GDP fluctuations, then the government can come in and try to smooth these fluctuations out a little bit. Others think that if supply side shocks are driving this, well, there's not very much the government can do to try to mitigate the business cycle. And as such, they can end up making things worse, even though they're trying to make things better. So let's talk about some of these schools of thought. The first one we're going to talk about is the classical school of thought. And this can be traced back to Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations. The classical economic school of thought was extremely hands-off in the economy. So if you've heard laissez-faire before, that pretty much perfectly sums up classical economics. They felt that the government was basically supposed to be a night watchman, just essentially make sure everybody's playing by the same rules. Nobody's abusing the system, and as long as nobody's abusing the system, doing anything egregiously wrong, the government would just leave everybody alone. They felt that excess regulation really wasn't good for the economy, and as such, there was very little focus on trying to mitigate business cycle fluctuations because they cared more about long-run growth. They didn't care so much about these short-run fluctuations. Do we go into a recession for a couple of months, maybe a year? They cared more like what happens in the long run. Are we fostering long-run economic growth? Because, yeah, these short-run fluctuations can suck, but overall, if we look, long run, the long run prosperity mattered more to them. And they were essentially supply side economists, and they thought that growth came from the supply side of the market. And as such, they felt growth could best be characterized by investment in capital goods and then things like low barriers to production and trade. So basically, encourage saving, encourage investment that drives economic growth, and then don't screw with anything. Don't stop people from trading and don't stop people from producing. Now, as financial markets became much more developed in the United States, the U.S. government began to think about instituting something like a central bank. Now, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was founded, and they were tasked with controlling the money supply. So if you're like, okay, well, what happened before that? Before that, banks had a private currency, and it was typically backed with gold, which meant that at any point in time, you could trade in $1 for some fixed amount of gold. Now, there were business cycles throughout that time between Adam Smith and then this next guy we're going to talk about, John Maynard Keynes, who started the Keynesian school of thought. But these recessions were pretty short-lived, and growth was stable overall. If we did have a rough recession, the government didn't really do much to mitigate it. And because there were very few complex financial markets, recovery was pretty easy. The government didn't have to step in to try to fix anything. But throughout the early part of the 20th century, financial markets really became more developed. The economy itself became more developed, much more complex, much more complicated. And the stock market crash of 1929 was just absolutely huge. The magnitude of the crash itself wasn't really unprecedented. There had actually been crashes earlier that were just as bad, if not worse. However, the slump that followed is still the worst that the U.S. economy's ever seen. And a lot of economists will argue what the causes of the Great Depression were. Nobody can really agree on that just yet, but there's pretty good agreement across the board that there was a disastrous combination of fiscal and monetary policy that contributed to remaining in that slump after the crash. Namely, the monetary policy stuff that was bad is the central bank didn't really do what they were supposed to do. Granted, they didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing at the time, but they essentially let the real money supply shrink, which led to deflation, and then some of the disastrous fiscal policy. Well, if you look at anything that FDR instituted with the New Deal, actually is argued to have extended the slump that followed the market crash of 1929 and, led to the Great Depression. Now, after the Great Depression hit, a lot of people started listening to this guy named John Maynard Keynes, because the Depression pretty much sucked, and the tools that were given to us by the classical economists just weren't cutting it. And this Keynes guy showed up, pretty much changed everything overnight. It was like the first major revamp in macroeconomic thought. He published the general theory, and it changed the perspective on macroeconomics, changed how we looked at things. Because prior to the general theory, the prevailing school of thought was just leave the recessions alone, don't worry about it, leave the business cycles alone, focus on long-run growth. But Keynes decided maybe it's time to look at the business cycle. And when he did that, he took the components of GDP and looked at them individually in terms of their volatility and how they were overall contributing to GDP fluctuations. His idea was that if you were to look at some of these, look at their volatility, see how much they're contributing to GDP, see, maybe then, okay, certain sectors might need a little bit more work than others when it comes to policy. So let's break up these components of GDP and look at them separately. Now, we're going to first take a good look at consumption, which appears to be the most stable of all components of GDP. Now, you may not see that because I haven't plotted it out yet, but trust me, if we look at consumption here, it looks relatively stable. Now, it turns out households tend to consume at a fairly consistent pace regardless of their income, and it's something known as consumption smoothing. And the idea is that people generally want to have a stable path of consumption over time. So they'll smooth their consumption out across periods of high income and periods of low income. So an example would be like if you get like a really huge bonus at work, you're not going to go and blow all that money at once. You're going to save the money, maybe increase your consumption a little bit over time, but overall, you're going to try to keep that money in savings as long as you possibly can. And the reason you would do that is to try to reduce uncertainty. You might have this huge bonus today, but you could lose your job tomorrow. You may not get another bonus next year, next quarter, whenever, you get bonuses. You don't know. You don't know what the future is going to bring. So you're going to want to hold some of that money in, kind of like a rainy day fund, in the event that you're going to have lower income tomorrow. So you're not going to go and blow all that money today. Now, another example would be like if you're in college and you expect to have a job making like, say, $100,000 a year. You're probably a little bit more likely to take out some student loans than if you expect to earn, say, $35,000 a year when you get out of college. Why? Because, well, if you're making $100,000 a year, it's going to be much easier to pay those student loans back than if you're making 35. And when it comes to these consumption savings considerations, it's better to think about it as borrowing from your future self rather than like borrowing from a bank. I mean, yeah, technically you are borrowing from a bank, but if you're borrowing it today, you got to pay it back tomorrow. And if you got to pay it back tomorrow, that's coming out of your future wages, your future income. So if you borrow that money today, well, you got to pay it back tomorrow. So really what you're doing is you're borrowing from your future self. Now, there's this show, it's probably a little too old to use as a reference now. It just makes me feel wonderful about my age. There's a show was called How I Met Your Mother. And there's this one episode where the two of the main characters are talking about going out and getting drunk one night. And they're like, well, what if we're hungover tomorrow? And one of them goes, you know what? Let future us deal with that problem. Screw those guys. It's kind of what's going on here, right? Because instead of borrowing happiness from the future, namely, not being hungover and super miserable, you're borrowing your income from the future today. So if we look at consumption plotted out over time, this is what we see. And this is in $2009, and I believe it's expressed in thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. I don't remember what. I think it's thousands, looking at the scale here. Couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Anyways, this Keynes guy argued that, okay, consumption's pretty stable, but investment is very volatile. And the reason it was so volatile is that investors, people who were spending and borrowing money to try to expand their business, were really panicky. They're panicky really as a function of like interest rates, because these interest rates will induce people to save. Right? If you have high interest rates today, you're going to want to save because, well, you'll get a higher return tomorrow. And then if there are high interest rates today, it's going to discourage people from borrowing because it could be cheaper to borrow. So people are going to save more. As they save more, the cost of borrowing, the interest rate, falls again. And then people become more willing to borrow because, well, there's more money available in the financial system to actually borrow. And the thing is, people don't usually invest with their own money that they already have. They tend to borrow it from other people. So the more people save, the more businesses can borrow. But if people are saving today, businesses probably shouldn't borrow until like tomorrow. So the investment that we're seeing depends on current interest rates, but also the path of expected future interest rates. So what happens if these investors think that interest rates are going to rise? Well, they're not going to want to invest. They're going to get spooked. And Keynes called this behavior the result of quote-unquote animal spirits. So if we look at investment over the same time frame and the same dollar, the same real base value for the dollar, 2009, this is what we're looking at. So we compare that. This is this is consumption here. And this is investment. Look how much more volatile investment is than consumption. But if we're looking at it in levels, it's not really going to tell us the whole story. It gives us a pretty good idea. But what if we were to break it down to percent changes over time? So instead of looking at just the level of consumption, the level of investment, it would be how it's changing over time. And it's really going to give us a better idea as to how volatile these components are. So let's break it down into percent changes. What we have in red is consumption. What we have in blue is investment. So where the peak, the highest percent change quarter over quarter value for consumption is a little under 5% in the early 1950s. That same time frame, we have an over 20% increase in investment. Similarly, we have maximum drops in investment quarter over quarter of almost 20%. And looking at this, the lowest we have is maybe 4% or something like that for consumption. So consumption is much more stable than investment, which lines up with that whole consumption smoothing argument I was making earlier, as well as the volatility in investment regarding investors getting a little spooked because of current and expected future interest rates. Now, as a result of that, Keynes felt that savings could be a problem and that excessive savings could lead to a recession or a depression. His idea was that if there are excessive savings, it could be the result of a drop in investment because things like falling consumer demand, overinvestment in previous periods, or maybe even just pessimistic outlooks about the future. And that could lead to a decline in overall economic performance. This is kind of going back to that dynamic inefficiency argument that we talked about in the solo growth model, sort of like an oversaving problem. But this whole thing runs counter to what the classicals had said, because the classicals wanted increased savings because savings meant growth, which isn't necessarily wrong, right? So maybe both Keynes and the classicals have valid arguments here. Because according to the classicals, if you save more, well, that's going to mean more growth because that's more money that's available for people to borrow. You get lower interest rates. Now, the reason that the classicals thought this was that everything was supply side. To them, all the important stuff was supply related, and they believed that demand was the result of supply. This Keynes guy showed up and suggested the opposite. He suggested that supply was actually the result of demand. So he argued that if slack demand was hitting the economy, then supply would respond negatively and the economy wouldn't be able to get out of the hole that it was in. So the classicals were a supply-side economist. Keynes was more of a demand-side economist. Namely, he felt that demand-side shocks would explain more of the fluctuations in real GDP, whereas the classicals would have felt that supply-side shocks explain more of the variation in GDP over time. So overall, Keynes did come up with some pretty cool ideas, and a lot of the tools that he developed are still used today, at least in some way, shape, or form. And investment counts for a very trivial fraction of GDP, but it accounts for almost half of its variance. So basically, the fact that it swings around a lot and really hurts GDP when investment falls means that maybe there's some room for improvement with stabilization policy. He suggested that government spending at least partially offset the drop in output, which resulted from a fall in investment. So let's go back to GDP and look at this for a second. Because you remember, if there's either no trade or if there's a perfect trade balance, GDP is equal to, or GDP is Y equals C plus I plus G. So if investment, I, falls and triggers a recession, Keynes felt the government could step in and spend some money to try to offset that fall in GDP. And if GDP falls, we end up in a recession, unemployment goes up, fewer people have jobs, and less people have money to spend, and the economy sucks pretty hard, right? So the idea would be like, what if we had the government spend money to offset that change? Could that help things a little bit? Keynes thought it could. Because Keynes thought the issue in the economy during a recession was slack aggregate demand. Basically, demand was falling. He argued that because of that slack demand, the economy would get a lot worse before it got any better during a recession, kind of would start to like spiral out of control. So what his idea was that have higher taxes during the economic boom. So when things are good, tax more and run a surplus. So you're taxing more, you're bringing in more revenue than what you're actually spending. So you get the surplus, like nice little rainy day fund at the aggregate level. And when the economy goes into a recession, you would then spend that revenue on trying to get the economy out of its slump. And it's what's known as countercyclical fiscal policy. Now, yeah, it's all well and good, but during the Depression, unemployment was hovering at like 25%. Now, to put that into perspective, it's usually in the neighborhood of like 2 to 3% on a good day. So labor markets really needed some work too. And Keynes argued that the issue with the persistently high unemployment that they were seeing at the time stemmed from informational problems, that basically workers and employers weren't being matched appropriately. So if you remember when we were talking about labor markets in the United States, we had different types of unemployment, right? Think about what type of unemployment this was, where you would have workers and employers just not being matched. The job existed, the person open to work existed, but they were unaware of each other's existence. So Keynes argued that there were inefficient search costs in trying to find employment. And if we go to dating markets again as an example, think about what things like Tinder and other dating apps did to try to solve the matching problem in dating markets. Well, you get job sites that do the exact same thing, only for jobs rather than trying to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And these were all these inefficiencies were created from that matching problem. And then all of these fixes, right? These job search programs, these dating apps were created because the matching problem exists. It was trying to alleviate the matching problem. Now, Keynes favored fiscal policy, which is like the government collecting tax revenue and then spending it all during a recession. He didn't so much care for monetary policy, which is the central bank printing money by buying or selling bonds to try to either inject or pull money out of circulation. He didn't care for it too much, but his successors eventually did. And the reason they thought that monetary policy could be effective was because prices are what's known as sticky, which means that they're slow to adjust to shocks. So what that means is that it's likely the current price level doesn't accurately reflect the state of the economy. Why would that be? Why would some prices be slow to adjust? Well, if you remember, Subway for the longest time had that $5 footlong thing, right? They were always advertising on that $5 footlong. Well, if there's an economic shock that hits and say there's a huge demand shock as a result of monetary policy, and they're like, okay, well, we're kind of taking a little bit of a loss right now on these $5 footlongs. They may want to try to raise the price, maybe a $5.50 footlong or a $6 footlong. But they'd just been marketing for years on this $5 footlong. People are used to that $5 footlong. If they raise the price now, people might start to get kind of pissed and be like, I don't really know if I want to go to Subway anymore. They keep screwing us over, keep raising the price. So it could actually be more costly for them to raise the price than it is to keep the price where it is and just produce more. Because if we assume price and quantity are the only two variables that a firm's looking at when they decide how much they want to produce, if the price can't change, but people have more money and there's, obviously they're pushing demand outward, The only way the firm can respond to that increase is by increasing how much they're producing. They increase the quantity. And this led to the rise of the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve suggests a relationship between two macro variables, output and unemployment. It suggests that there's a predictable trade-off between inflation, or why did I say output and unemployment? Inflation and unemployment, not output, my bad. There's a predictable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this relationship exists because an increase in inflation could reduce unemployment, or conversely increase output. Because if we're looking at unemployment or output, they're really like, kind of two different sides of the same coin, right? So if we were to increase inflation, we would reduce unemployment. If unemployment's reduced, we're increasing output. Now, this idea is partially right and partially wrong, as we'll learn a little bit later on when it comes to rules versus discretion in monetary policy. And the idea would be, if there's more discretion in monetary policy, then policymakers have a little bit more leeway in terms of increasing inflation to try to reduce unemployment. The idea there is that if we grant more discretion, if people favor discretion in monetary policy, they care a little bit more about keeping unemployment low or output high than they do keeping inflation low. Now, when it comes to the rules-based side of things, right, the idea there is that central bankers are bound by a set of rules. They don't really have so much leeway in terms of what they can and can't do. There's really just more what they can't do. And it is designed to try to keep inflation low. And people that favor rules-based systems in monetary policy tend to think inflation is much more important than unemployment or output. Now, like I said, the Phillips curve thing here is partially right, partially wrong. There is a relationship. However, it's not always a predictable relationship, which we'll learn a little bit more when we come into things like rational expectations in the next couple of lectures. So in short, Keynesian economists focused heavily on aggregate demand. They felt that it was volatile and unstable, and if the government could come in and try to stabilize aggregate demand, then it would stabilize the economy and smooth the business cycle out a little bit. And Keynes himself advocated more for fiscal policy. However, his followers would eventually push for both fiscal and monetary policy. Now, this is going to wrap up our lecture on the first part of business cycles. The next time we meet, we're going to talk about the other schools of thought, which leads to the birth of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, the problems that led to the DSGE revolution, and why we use these types of models in the first place. And then we're going to be covering the other major schools of thought, which is the monetarist school. And then these last two, the new classical and new Keynesian schools, are really the schools that began to use the DSGE models. So we're going to talk about the contributions of these schools next when it comes to modern macroeconomic theory. And then after that, we will start the real business cycle model, which is the new classical school of thought. So thank you for watching, and the next video will be out shortly.